Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Lina Malagon, one of the researchers of the project we are discussing today, along with Professor Fionnuala Neolain, Professor Rory O'Connell, and Professor Bill Ralston. Just a reminder that we are recording this session and it will be made available on YouTube after the event, and also we will produce some short edited clips from it. Then let me share my screen to share with you some of them. Oops. Great. Yes, great. This presentation is based on projects at Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, supported by the Global Challenge Research Hub on Gender, Justice and Security. The hub has 5 research teams and more than 40 projects worldwide, focusing on Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and Uganda, and of course, Northern Ireland. These projects we are talking about today are part of the Transformation and Empowerment research team. You can read more about that in our web site. Let me briefly explain about our projects. This project, the first one is the Socioeconomic Rights and Transition project. This project is to map how socioeconomic rights are bargained in and out of peace agreements and what form those bargains take. This project also seeks to identify the modalities that lead to the exclusion of social and economic rights. And the overall goal is to better understand the universe of claim making in conflict transformation, as well as to zone in on claims that become strengths in law and practice. The other project is the Colonialism and Transition project. This project studies how the colonial past shaped conditions conducive to contemporary conflict and how shall engaging this past shape contemporary conflict ending solutions. In particular, the project seeks to understand how colonial past shape injustice and how contemporary responses to transition can or should take the harms of colonialism into account when shaping our understanding of remedy, accountability, and reparation in the present. We are particularly interested in the relationship between colonial harms and patterns of gender injustice that are deeply rooted in post-colonial societies. Today, we will discuss how these projects and challenges relate to the field of transitional justice. Then briefly, let me say that transitional justice addresses how societies deal with a past of conflict or oppression, whether this be the Northern Irish Troubles or the Colombian armed conflict, for example. For the United Nations, transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. Then our questions today are related to structural injustices, and we will try three aspects of these topics. The question here is: does transitional justice overlook the elephants in the room? Can it speak to major structural and historical wrongs like patriarchy, colonialism, neoliberalism? Should transitional justice be revised or retired? Having into account that transitional justice seeks to establish liberal democratic orders, marginalizing other wider notion of democracy, which put stronger emphasis on democratic control of the economy and or social inequality. Taking for granted the liberal separation of the political institutions and socio-economic spheres, transitional justice as a field is slightly reduced to the former. This means that scholarship turns a blind eye on the political economy of transitional justice processes. Colonialism and lack of equality, for women as root causes of the conflict. And of course, on other major structural injustices as racism, for example, that we are not addressing today. However, let me say some particular elements of each of these topics. On colonialism, the majority of states to which transitional justice mechanisms are applied are former colonies. But colonial occupation, decolonization, and the ongoing legacy of colonialism frequently go unremarked in transitional justice debates and policymaking. Despite the lack of formal attention to colonialism, battles persist over the legitimacy of colonial borders, the validity of enduring legal instruments of colonial control and memory wars, including the writing and telling of story during and after the colonial period. Debates about colonialism rarely shape the construction of remedies in the present, and in many societies, including Northern Ireland, the history of colonialism might be seen as irrelevant or marginal to contemporary challenges. In Colombia, that is our comparative site of analysis, there is substantial challenge to the relevance of colonial discourses, and even to the terminology that ought to be used to describe the past and its influence on the present. We are also profoundly interested in understanding if it's possible to make comparisons across colonial experience, what the ethical and methodological limits of that endeavor might be. In terms of neoliberalism, understood as an economic model pushing regulation on economies and around the world for forcing open national markets to trade and capital, and for demanding that governments shrink themselves by austerity or privatization. Neoliberal practices deepen inequality and discrimination, in particular in deeply divided societies. And conflict often has deep roots in different forms of social and economic injustice, including structural violence, discrimination, and inequality. Then transitional justice and peace provisions in peace agreements requires these root causes to be addressed. Finally, with our third topic today, patriarchy, the essential existence and consequences of patriarchy as defining element of repression, governance, and regulation in most societies, including conflicted society, is underestimated. Naming patriarchy as a structural impediment to ending conflict is an important prerequisite to addressing the practical manifestation of patriarchy. The structure of peacemaking is itself a patriarchal construct, which partially explains the resistance to pursue the changes to include women, as well as the lack of influence on peace outcomes even when women are included. Then I'm not going to hand over to my colleagues for their thoughts on in these topics. They will present and speak for no more than 10 minutes. Let me say and let me ask you all, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box where Nisan and Lizzie, my colleague, is acting as moderator. Now I pass the floor to Rory. Thank you, Rory.
Thank you, Lena, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us for our reflections today on these topics. I'd like to just make some points by way of background and then discuss Northern Ireland, Northern Irish conflict and peace process as it relates to some of these themes. By way of background, as Lena has explained, we are involved in multiple projects within the broader UK Global Challenges Research Fund, Research Hub on Gender Justice and Security. And the idea for this event grew out of discussions about what ties together the three different projects that we are working on that Lena has outlined. Part of what ties those together is that in different ways they are addressing major forms of structural injustice, the world historical crime of colonialism, major socioeconomic inequalities in the form of neoliberalism, and unequal gender relations in the form of patriarchy. They are not the only form of structural injustice. Racism stands out as one we have not explicitly named. They are not the only world historical crimes, but there are three worth exploring. Drawing what others have said about these wrongs elsewhere, they're structural and ideological in nature. Iris Marion Young's posthumous Responsibility for Justice highlights features of structural injustice. It is experienced as constraining, it is positional, it is reproduced in action, and it often leads to unintended consequences. Critical thinkers from Marx to Brown have underlined the nature of ideologies. Ideologies portray the interests of particular individuals as if they were universal interests. They naturalize or reify social structures, or even worse, make them invisible. I discussed this topic with a certain degree of trepidation. My own background is quite legalist in nature and concerned with how we interpret legal norms in a way that is deliberative, inclusive, and participatory. But there are, of course, many limits to that approach. And so I have to say that many other people have dealt with these issues from the benefit of greater experience and insight. And I draw on them, including, of course, many of the people that we have been fortunate to interview for our research project on Northern Ireland. So I'll be drawing on some of their insights over the next few minutes. Reflecting on those insights, there are some links I would highlight between the topic of neoliberalism and economic inequality and the other forms of structural injustice my colleagues are discussing. One of the striking economic interpretations of Northern Ireland by Michael Farrell, but not just by Michael Farrell, is how sectarianism and political difference were used to play off socialists and working class, unionists and nationalists, Protestants and Catholics. This tactic of separation is reminiscent of many colonial strategies. See Thoreau's excoriating critique of British imperialism in India, fostering division between Muslim and Hindu. What is also striking from several interviewees is how when community development work becomes professionalized or money is given to local bodies to invest, women are excluded from spaces they previously occupied in civil society and the public sphere. But this takes me to my second half of the presentation. Where does this concern fit with the history of the Northern Ireland conflict? Economic interpretations of the Northern Irish conflict are but one set of interpretations among many different competing ones. Other interpretations include those focused on internal factors, like the divided political and social nature of Northern Ireland. The terrorism criminality narrative, often linked to claims of foreign interference. The independence struggle narrative, again, often linked to claims of foreign interference, and so on. The economic dimensions of the conflict don't always attract as much attention as some of these, but there have been important arguments and debates, some of which highlight the complexity of the problem, and that sometimes interference by foreign economic actors has not always been negative. There is a suggestion, for instance, though a disputed one, that concern about foreign investment in the 1960s may have led Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, O'Neill, to shift the focus of unionism temporarily in a more reformist direction. Whatever the truth about that, the reality was that any reform was too little too late and did not carry sufficient unionist support or address adequately the demands for civil rights in the 1960s. More concretely, the 1980s saw the development of the McBride Principles, commitments by US firms not to invest in Northern Ireland unless problems of employment discrimination against the Catholic nationalist population are addressed. Combined with detailed criticisms provided by, amongst others, the Standing Advisory Committee on Human Rights, this led to the strengthening of the laws on fair employment, banning religious and political discrimination in Northern Ireland, and most notably the Fair Employment Act 1989 and later Fair Employment and Treatment Order 1998, introducing sophisticated and distinctive affirmative action measures into Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement, 1998, offers different perspectives on the social and economic dimensions of the conflict. In one part of the agreement, there is talk about economic, social, and cultural rights, but in others, this is limited to social and cultural rights. And when it comes to the details, the very important details in the parts on rights, safeguards, and equality of opportunity, these all become economic, social, and cultural interests and not rights. The agreement does include provisions on equality of opportunity and some support for participatory governance. At the same time, the agreement speaks about sustained economic growth, promoting social inclusion, new regional development strategies. Many of these are fairly generally worded, And as one of our interviewees explained, vaguely worded clauses allow those with power to interpret them. And this has come to pass. Part of the social problems in this jurisdiction have included a failure to deal with housing needs, which particularly address the Catholic and nationalist population, though there are also housing problems in Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist areas. Discrimination in housing was one of the sparks that precipitated conflict in the 1960s. Most of the past 20 years, the approach in relation to addressing housing need has been to rely on non-state bodies to deliver social housing and offer some support through the private rental sector. It is literally only last week that the minister responsible for housing announced new plans for the main state body to get back to the business of building social housing. Similarly, as one of our other interviewees noted, one of the major crises which destabilized political institutions here was tied to the conservative and liberal democratic policy of austerity and the introduction of welfare reform in 2010. So economic inequality and assumptions typical of neoliberalism to at least some extent shape our context and have the potential to disrupt our progressing in transitioning from conflict and division. And here I have to signal some worries about how effectively legal strategies like human rights and transitional justice can address these issues. There were some provisions in the Good Friday Agreement and subsequent agreements which promised more on equality and participation. And yet they have not been delivered, or as one interviewee put it, when delivered, they have fallen into the trap of being done in such a proceduralist way, with such an emphasis on process that it denudes them of any transformative potential. All is not negative, though. Our interviewees stressed the importance of civil society members, trade unionists, human rights groups, and others working with each other and different types of alliance in order to further their agenda. They stressed the importance of being prepared to adopt different strategies, including indeed legal strategies and litigation, and most importantly, being aware that delivering on social and economic transformation is a matter of never giving up the struggle. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Bill Ralston.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, you can hear me? Okay, good. Hello, folks. I'm following on from the same theme of Rory and Lena before me. And the way I'll start is by saying this, that the starting point for the research that I'm doing with Fionnuala Ní Éileann and our researcher Claire, who's not here today, is to argue or to take one of the criticisms of transitional justice, that it seeks a restoration of the status quo ante without seeking to excavate the deep roots of that status quo. One prime example is in relation to colonialism. Take, for example, the issue of truth commissions, which Lena mentioned. They rarely examine directly colonial structures and their legacy, despite this being a very fruitful source in understanding current inequalities in places as distinct as Guatemala and South Africa. So what we've done is started a comparative study of Ireland and Colombia. Given that our knowledge of Ireland was quite good to begin with, we decided to get into the area we knew less about, or next to nothing about, Colombia. So let me get you up to speed on what we've been doing. As elsewhere, the Colombian peace process has virtually no reference to colonialism, yet arguably many of the issues with which it has to deal, armed violence, internally displaced people, land appropriation, they have roots in colonial conquest and structures. So that's why we've been exploring in our interviews 4 key areas: land, gender, ethnicity, and law. Let me run through each of them very, very quickly. Let's take law. Law was in many ways constitutive of colonial conquest. Rather than simply seizing territory, conquerors involved themselves in legal rituals. For example, in South America, when the conquistadors came to a new place of territory they proposed to expropriate, they would read the requerimento to the inhabitants before taking their land or slaughtering them. The British in North America insisted also on a formal legal ceremony when taking possession of territory. One colonizer wrote in Ireland in 1612, something that actually sums up this whole aspect in relation to land and law. To give laws to a conquered people, this is a quote, is the principal mark and effect of a perfect conquest. Fair enough, but it's difficult to build a bridge between this history and the details and complexity of contemporary democratic law. Second, gender. A guy called Michael Horswell in 2003 did a major study of lots of sources of pre-Columbian Latin American culture, written sources, which were few, but drawings, woven sources, orally transmitted sources, and he concluded that it was common in pre-Columbian Latin American society to have a ritual enactment of a third gender. That third gender was subalternized when colonial discourse arrived. Colonialism entailed the creation and imposition of the idea of only two genders. Now, care needs to be taken not to exaggerate or romanticize this point. Moreover, there's no way back to reconstructing that third space, either analytically or even more substantively in contemporary society. However, it is worth realizing that colonialism did have an effect on genders and gender relations, and possibly links to current levels, horrific levels of femicide in places like Mexico. Third, land. We're on stronger ground here in terms of seeing a connection between land and power, land and landlessness to resistance in the history of Colombia. Whether the expropriation of the conquistadors, the rural-urban divide in the Civil War of the 1950s, the roots of FARC in rural resistance, and of the paramilitaries in the desire of big landlords to retain the status quo, land became a huge issue in Colombia. There has been a displacement of an estimated close to 8 million people. Coca growing is still an issue, and the war on drugs follows on this. There are disputes over extractive industries, and water in other parts of the Andes outside of Colombia is a huge issue too. So it's almost impossible not to see these issues linked to the colonial conquest. Fourthly, ethnicity. Throughout Latin America, and indeed Colombia in particular, there is the myth of mestizaje, of mixing. The belief is that unlike North America, Latin America's societies developed as mixed and therefore less racially structured. Now that myth can be challenged at any number of levels. To begin with, there's one writer, Shuey, who says, rape is the founding act and trope of mestizaje. Another measure, there has been only one indigenous political leader and no black political leader in any of the countries of South America since independence. The myth of mestizaje is less a call to decolonization and inclusion than an argument underpinning white dominion. Challenged in the 19th century that they could never develop in the same way European nations did, Latin American nations responded by representing mestizaje as a stage on the road to whiteness. At least the population was not black or indigenous, but was increasingly mixing to the point of favouring the superior races over the inferior. As Loveman puts it, mestizaje was presumed to reduce the relative influence of Indianness and Africanness on the nation, while enhancing the influence of Europeanness or native whiteness. So the links to contemporary racial and ethnic inequality in Colombia, again, I think are obvious. Okay, so far, so good, but also so abstract. The key question is, that we're asking, is how can transitional justice deal with any of this? And let me just run through a whole list of woe. Prosecutions are out of the question. I think that's sort of obvious, so I'll not linger on that one. 2, the slaughter of conquest can't be reversed. Quijano estimates that in the Andean area, the conquest led to the deaths of 65 million inhabitants in a period of less than 50 years, perhaps the biggest single genocide this planet has known. What possibly could transitional justice 500 years later do about that? What about restoring the land? Whom to? The originally dispossessed? Who are their descendants? Are their descendants the current occupiers of the land? What about reparations? Where to begin and where to end? You can't get at the direct victims of that slaughter years ago, but there are more recent direct victims. Yet on the other hand, what about the descendants of the historically displaced, the massacred, the enslaved, if they could even be identified? We could look towards an official apology, but Australia, which has tried that in a big way, has led to mixed reactions among the indigenous people there. Symbolic reparation is another aspect. I think this is an important one, and I'd gladly talk about this later. It's significant, but in many ways it really, really is minimalist. Truth commissions can offer acknowledgement, and that's one of their strongest outcomes, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Where repression and impunity rest on denial, acknowledgement is at least a partial form of justice, so perhaps there's some redress there. And lastly, that other bulwark of transitional justice, non-repetition. In one sense, this can be guaranteed. The conquistadors are not coming back. But their legacy is apparent in all aspects of society. As the Palestinians put it, it's not just that there was a catastrophe in 1948. The catastrophe, the Nakba, is with us every day. Now, on the basis of all of that, it would be possible to say, well, look, give up now. You're not going to get anywhere in this. But how dare we? We shall plough on. I just want to raise one other point, though, which has struck me in the course of doing the interviews that we've done, all of them remotely and all done by our colleague Claire. A lot of people we talked to in Colombia said that this was not an issue, colonial legacy was not an issue, which surprised us very greatly. And they immediately turned the conversation to coloniality. And the argument of coloniality, very, very simply, don't throw things at me for putting this in a very shorthand way, is that something happened to the planet in 1492 when Columbus sailed. His voyage introduced a new cosmology, a new epistemology to the earth, a way of looking at the world and the people in the world that was divided along racial terms. And that is still with us. And it has gone through all sorts of forms, whether it's been the different colonialisms that there have been, British, English, Dutch, German, Italian. Even the Scots had their own colony briefly in Latin America. It was a total failure, by the way. So all these colonialisms are aspects of it. But then even post-colonialism, after formal independence, coloniality exists in neo-colonial forms, whether it's the neoliberalism that Lena and Rory are looking at, or new empires that come on the world, like the American empire and so on and so on. So on that basis, there's no point just looking at what happened 500 years ago and what its effects might be today. It's a very good point, and I'm going to not try to, in the time I can't, but I'm not going to try to completely answer it, but I'm just going to put one question in there. Yes, the world is ill-divided. Yes, there is inequality. Yes, there is racism. Yes, there is patriarchy. But who populates the lower elements of that hierarchy? Why is it that Afro-Caribbeans and Afro-Colombians are at the bottom of society? Why are indigenous people at the bottom of societies the world out from North America to Australia? Why is it that there was a struggle for civil rights for Catholics here because they were at the bottom? Why was there a struggle for civil rights for black people in the States? So what I'm saying is that if you look at who populates the lower rungs of inequality, the explanation for that lies ultimately in colonial structures. So you can talk about coloniality, but you shouldn't lose sight of the history that got us to the present forms of colonial legacy and colonial structures, and indeed neo-colonial structures. Okay, I rest my case there.
Yes, so thank you. So our final speaker today is our colleague Professor Fionnuala Ní Eallain. And Fionnuala is Professor of Law at the Queen's University of Belfast, Regents Professor and holder of the Robina Chair in Law and Policy at the University of Minnesota. And as if that is not enough, she is also co-director with Angelica Rethberg of Los Andes of the Transformation and Empowerment Stream on this project, the Gender Justice and Security Hub. And for good measure, and most importantly, she is the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the protection and promotion of human rights while countering terrorism. In that capacity, unfortunately, she is often required to attend important and imperative United Nations meetings. And unfortunately, that has happened this morning, this afternoon, our time. Realizing this might be a possibility, she kindly agreed to record a very insightful presentation that I was fortunate enough to hear yesterday. So Nissan is now going to share this with you, and you can see how Fionnuala integrates our different concerns in this insightful message. Nissan?
Morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fionnuala Ní Eallain, Professor of Law at the Queen's University of Belfast, and involved in this project in two ways. I work with Rory and Lena on the project that we are advancing on socioeconomic rights in the context of conflict and post-conflict settings. And Bill Rolston and I are working on a project together which is looking at the colonialism piece of the transitional justice puzzle, and exploring the ways in which colonial pasts continue to have a long-standing reach into the contemporary, and the ways in which colonial pasts shape both the experience of harm, but also the ways in which we can or should, exploring the ways whether we can or should remedy the harms of colonial pasts in the present. It's in this context that I'm going to make a couple of remarks to the discussion today, particularly focused on patriarchy. As a feminist scholar of international law and human rights, I have always tried to integrate this sort of feminist analysis into the substantive work that I do. And one of the really exciting things about the projects that we're all working on is the way in which that gender analysis is really mainstreamed in, or central to the way we both shape the idea of the problem that we're working with and the kinds of solutions or analysis that we are deriving from the work we're doing. So let me say a little bit about patriarchy. I think it's an interesting thing to note that patriarchy is sort of a word that's out of fashion with feminists, also in some ways out of fashion with liberals. It's a word that gets less used perhaps than it should, or less consistently analytically applied to many of the contemporary problems that we face in conflict, post-conflict and transitional settings. Maybe just to say a little bit about that, the origins of patriarchy are found, the word patriarchy, its genealogy, is found in Roman law, in the idea of the pater familias, the patriarchal head of the family. So there's a deep connection between the sort of notion of patriarchy and the function of the family in society, and the ways in which the role as head of household is then replicated across a range of other key sites in social structures and political power and in economic practice. Some of the challenges, I think, are the perceived challenges of working with this term are, one, its association with the family, and often the ways in which the family is such a deep site of contestation for feminists, one that's really argued and fought over, one that many feminists are not so comfortable working within. More than that, I think there's a sense that patriarchy is sort of an essentialism approach, that it sort of reduces a discussion of a complex set of interactions around gender and sex to a highly binary notion of male-female, but also of the particularities of men's roles through the prism of patriarchy. And has been seen in some ways as been out of step with more textured language like intersectionality and critical feminist theories, including critical race feminists working in the spaces that we're talking about. But I think I would make the argument for the continued relevance of this terminology, and particularly it's relevant to understanding the impact of colonial pasts on the present. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I think it's also really important to hold on to this language in part, and this concept in part, because I think the relevance of patriarchy, the importance of patriarchal form and its expression in law continues to be felt in the power of masculinity, in the power of that expression in conflict, in post-conflict, and in peacemaking settings. And so I think there's this sort of distinct line to be drawn between the expression of masculinities in these contemporary sites, which is not just about the number of men in the room, but the way in which the work is done, with the genealogy of patriarchy. Let me say a little bit about why I think patriarchy is indispensable to understanding colonial legacies. It states the obvious, I think, to say that colonial power had profound patriarchal underpinnings. And that's not only in the structure of male power, which defined colonial exercises, whether in Ireland or in places like Colombia, or in French colonies too. But it's also to say that the working out of power from the family shaped the way in which the state then went out to colonize and engage in colonial practices in other places. I think it's really important, and one of the things that we hope to explore, particularly in the Colombian process, which is where Bill and I are doing a lot of our comparative work, is the distinct role and regulation of the family as part of the colonial project, how those historical legacies are in fact, in some sense, hardwired in to some of the contemporary challenges we face around gender equality, gender inclusion, and the experience of women both during conflict, but also the capacity to engage women substantively in peacemaking and peace enforcement. I think one of the key elements of that I see is the distinctions that are drawn between particular colonial subjects, usually men, and the ways in which particular men were drawn into and made part of the colonial project. So the complexity of the colonial project is that, of course, it's never just done by the colonizer alone. It involves a range of entrapments, we might call them, or distinct benefits that accrue to particular groups in society during the course of the colonial project, that classic divide and conquer strategy. But the masculinities of men and the role of benefits in families were distinctly tied to that ensnaring process. And some of the key distinctions and some of the ways in which it becomes difficult to dislodge power and benefits, and benefits in particular in the post-conflict and transitional setting, have deep roots in these colonial structures, which in themselves also have these profound gender underpinnings and gender benefits that were received by particular men and particular families in colonial settings. The final comment I'd like to make in this context is also a complex and heavily contested one, which is to address the centrality of sexual conquest and sex-based ordering to the colonial enterprise. Scholars such as Pasha Bueno Hansen, working in the Peruvian context, have outlined and really demonstrated to us how sexual domination was an essential part of the colonial project, and the modern day experiences of sexual violation, systemic sexual violation for minority and indigenous groups in Peru, were actually overlaid on those colonial patterns of both economic expropriation, but also sexual domination and sexual expropriation. And those patterns of owning bodies as well as owning space in colonial settings have long and deep roots. And again, it's really disclosing or identifying the trenchant and deep nature of patterns that may look like they're incidental or modern in conflicted or transitional societies, and understanding that the pathways of those violations are long and deep and really encoded in ways that makes them very difficult to dislodge. Now, the harder part, of course, from the colonial perspective is how do we best dislodge and redress the challenges that we face when even if we can recognize and see those patterns, what kinds of remedies are available to us in the contemporary moment when many of these colonial modalities are long since set down and are now encoded as, if you want, as normal in societies. And I think that's the challenge I hope to discuss in the Q&A, and it's, I hope, the challenge that we will be able to address in the work that we're doing both in Northern Ireland but also in Colombia in this project. Many thanks to you all.
Well, thanks to my colleagues for their presentations. And I suppose Bill did a very good resume of the problems, but I see we have a question, Ms. Ann. You want to share our person?
I see there's a question there from me, from Matthew, on the Q&A. I think questions are coming in from both Q&A and chat, so it's a wee bit confusing. There's a Q&A question, if I can take it very briefly, Matthew. You've asked, given all the problems I've raised, should we just forget about law? Well, I would say that I mightn't be that nihilistic. I would say that don't romanticize law, don't reify law, don't presume that law is the solution to all the problems, because many of the problems, because of the difficulties of law tackling these huge structural and systemic issues, it may be foolish to leave the issue solely to law. Let's put it that way. It may be necessary to think of other, much more imaginative ways, social ways, cultural ways, dramatic, artistic, various other ways. That's why, for example, I said that although it was small and insignificant, I wouldn't downplay the role that symbolic reparation can make in many societies. I'll just leave it at that so that other people can get in on the discussion.
Can I maybe comment on Eileen's question? The panel today is 50-50 male and female and male. How can we increase awareness of patriarchy in wider society? And this is an issue that came up in the initial stages of our Northern Ireland research and came up quite naturally. The Good Friday Agreement talks about improving women's participation in public life, but the implementation of that has been lackluster in many ways. We do have the paradox, of course, that in Northern Ireland, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister and the leader of the third main political party are all female. But then when we look outside of that elite level, there are problems with issues of gender balance. As I say, several of our interviewees gave the example of when community services become professionalized and volunteer jobs become paid jobs, then men start to take over, or when funds have to be distributed to local communities, the groups that distribute them tend to be, again, dominated. We had the experience of I think a 15-member commission on flags and other cultural symbols being appointed in Northern Ireland. And as far as I recall, it was 15 people appointed that commission, only one was a woman. So there's a huge issue to be done in terms of improving issues of gender balance, addressing the issues of patriarchy. and thinking about democratic society, not just in terms of conventional representative democracy, but in terms of more inclusive and egalitarian notions of democracy. Some writers, for instance, speak about the need to develop a parity model of democracy that could then have ramifications, not just in terms of gender relations, but across issues of culture, how we remember the past, and how we address social and economic inequality.
Thank you, Rory. There are a couple of questions directed at Bill. Maybe I'll read them quickly and he can address them. The first one is, Bill pointed out that most traditional TJ mechanisms won't be very effective to address these structural and historical injustices. Do you think that TJ should start thinking outside of its traditional toolbox, for example, in terms of development policies, education, etc.? And the second question to Bill is, who defines whether a society has transitioned? Would the success of a society transitioning be based on Western liberal framework? And the last one is, I wonder if Bill could speak about the denial of colonialism in Northern Ireland, particularly with regard to Irish history and its revisionism.
Nissan, there's actually a fourth, which I'll get to last. I've answered the first one in a different guise with the question that Matthew asked, so I hope you don't mind if I skip that one, Zana. The one, let me go to Sandra's one about denial of colonialism. Yes, this is the question. If you ask, was Ireland colonised, and look at the academic literature, there is a part of the literature which says it never was colonised. It was only incorporated as the Anglo-Norman structures expanded from Aquitaine beyond the marches into Wales, beyond the borders into Scotland, and then eventually Ireland. So there was no conquest, there was no colonisation. That's a minor view. A more major view is that there was colonialism once upon a time, but it's over. This raises a further question, when did it end, folks? Some people say it ended in 1800 with the Act of Union and the incorporation of Ireland within the British system. Other people say it ended in 1921 with the formation of the Irish Free State, although try telling that to people in Northern Ireland who still think they live in a colony. And other people say, including Brendan O'Leary most recently, that it ended with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. My own position is that none of those are correct. I think that colonialism may end formally with a peace treaty or a withdrawal or whatever, but the issue of colonialism is wider than any of those formal political moments. So I would argue, one, Ireland was colonised, and secondly, that issue of colonisation is still relevant. You're right, Sandra, it is not taught in Northern Ireland schools. What about who decides what a transition is? It is a Western liberal model. Unfortunately, in the whole TJ industry worldwide, yes, it is a Western liberal model, which is why you get a lot of African activists and theorists, and increasingly Latin American activists and theorists sort of reject the model. I would say, at the risk of sounding like an easy cliche, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, whatever that means, and we don't have time to explore what that means now. Could I take the last one from Mindy? Why are you putting Colombia and Northern Ireland together? Because I wanted to go visit Colombia. No, that's a bad answer. I had been to Colombia and I fell in love with the place. No, it seemed to me that if you want to do comparative research, there are easy ways to do it and less easy ways to do it. This is a less easy way to do it, to take two things that don't look like they might compare, and you really are testing the methodology, you're testing the theories, if you can try to see where they differ and where they link up. And here's the point, why it is mainly difficult, and I don't know if this is why you asked the question, Mindy, is that most of the areas being looked at in this GCRF research are in the global south. Yet many of the theorists and researchers are from the global north. Ireland, I think, has this funny position of being global north, but somehow, at least in the past, depending on your answer to when colonialism ended, sort of like the global south in some ways. So that's why it seemed interesting to try to see if those two things paired in any way and what you might get out of that.
Thank you, Bill. There's also a follow-up question to Mindy's question here from Matthew. Do you engage with or apply the notion of the settler colony as opposed to colonialism more broadly? Does it apply to Ireland, North and Republic, for instance? And there's another one, maybe you can, like one of you can address them both together. And the other one is, how would you aim to strike a balance between addressing the historic harms like colonialism and more contemporary violations, such as modern conflicts in Northern Ireland and Colombia? Mm-hmm. Would Rory or Lena like to comment on any of these questions, maybe?
Maybe just to go back to some of the points that have been raised in some of the different questions and comments. I noticed one early provocative one about abandoning law and different other questions raised about the role of law and the role of colonial or imperial law in shaping civil laws in colonized countries. So these are all very rich and provocative questions, all of which I like, in that they highlight complexities and challenge assumptions. There are sometimes assumptions made about the state of civil laws in former colonized countries and how they are repressive of women's rights, but quickly glancing over the fact that many of these laws were developed or imposed during colonial times, in which case the people who benefited and the people who were responsible are somewhat different from a standard interpretation. And when it comes to law, I always like the metaphor H.L.A. Hart, I think, talked about the noble dream and the nightmare of law. And law offers both ideals and nightmares. And abandoning law and the promise of law, I see where the question is coming from. At the moment, we have a government in the United Kingdom that in several important respects is trying to undermine the protection of the rule of law. And it's not something which is not, of course, what the questioner is saying, but that is certainly not something that will make for a fair, more just society. Bill, I think you wanted to come in on some of the points briefly.
Just one. I mean, Matthew, I know, Matthew, you had a question, but you did ask a very good question. It's highly emotive, the potential answer to your question. I think the easiest way I can say it in the time that we have is this. There is no denying that settler colonialism was the form of colonialism that existed in Ireland. That's what the plantations were. There's no other way to define them other than settler colonialism. But the crucial question is this, to ask not just of here, but of anywhere. When do settlers stop being settlers? What is it that makes settler colonialism go? And the only thing I will say is that if the structures that advantaged the descendants of settlers remain, then the legacy of settler colonialism remains.
Well, thank you so much for the session today. We have many different questions. We really like to attend all of them, but probably it's impossible. Just the final remarks for us is definitely, well, patriarchy, colonialism, neoliberalism are structural and ideological wrongs in nature. And we are addressing this and seeing if transitional justice and post-conflict settings can deal with these structural injustices. This is critical. It requires a permanent analysis and review of the processes that the conflicts countries and territories are leading with these mechanisms and dealing with these measures to solve the past. Thank you for all the questions. We will definitely try to discuss more about patriarchy. We have really interesting questions about that, but I think it's it would be very, very important to say that understand the role of patriarchy, neoliberalism, and racism, and other structural injustices very essential to address conflicts. And we are working in understand better these elements and trying just to provide better ideas on it in practice. Then thank you so much. I think this is the end. Thanks all for coming today.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks. Thanks for the
Bye.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.